The E&S module is required for all applications. So whether it's general permit, individual permit, it doesn't matter. It's going to have the E&S module 1. Now, what this does is it kind of streamlines the project. You no longer have to put your own narrative together. This has all the information that we need to suffice as your narrative. One thing to note is that the directions are different between doing an individual and a general. So again, you want to have those, you almost want to keep those directions and right with you side by side as you're filling out the NOI and you're filling out the E&S modules. That's overall has been the best way I found to do it, and I think it's a good system, at least until you get the hang of it and get all the boxes and what each one means. With the E&S module, although you don't have to prepare a separate narrative, you do need to attach any calculations that you're doing. So if you have silt fence, silt sock, swales, anything that has calculations associated with it, you need to attach those to the module. This is probably a good point to talk about sort of organization and putting your applications together. So what we recommend doing is keeping your modules all together and then shuffling in any attachments right at the end of those modules so that you basically will have your NOI/application, and behind that you'll have your modules and your attachments, and then you'll have obviously your plans and all the other information that you need to make your application complete. So this looks at the actual, excuse me, this looks at the actual module and some of the information that you need to provide. Box 1, you're going to need to describe the site, the topography of the site, and the immediately surrounding area. Box 2 talks about the soils, and obviously you're going to be pulling that from the NRCS website, and that's where you're going to put the information. And again, if you're going to be answering yes down here, you're going to need to provide a wetland determination. And again, that includes soils that have hydric inclusions. And we talked earlier about Act 2 and soil contamination. There is a question right down at the bottom that speaks to that, and you'll need to fill that in.
Just 3 soil types?
What was that?
If you go back, there's only space for 3 soil types.
You can add more. If you have a project that has more, you can add it. You can add additional sheets with this.
Okay, additional sheets.
Yep. If you guys have questions, I'm gonna ask you to hold them to the end, just because it's a long presentation, and hopefully your question's going to be answered as we go through. Just jot it down on the note cards, and at the end you can ask it, and we'll get to it. So here, you're going to be describing the earth disturbance activity and the past and the present and proposed land uses. So this kind of replaces the question about, what was it 5 years ago? What was it 50 years ago? You're going to be putting that in this box here and give a description. Next, you're going to be describing the volume and rate of the runoff from the project. This isn't a quantitative analysis. This is more a qualitative analysis and discussion. So next we get into what BMPs you're using for the site. You'll notice that every BMP from the BMP manual has been listed through this section, and it goes in order in which the BMPs were introduced in the BMP manual. So as you go through, you're going to check which ones you're using, identify what plans they're on, identify where the O&M is, and then if there are any deviations from the E&S manual. Now you may be asking yourself, why do I need to note if there's any deviations from the ENS manual. Now, this is important because depending on the deviation, you may be kicked into an alternative BMP analysis that's done through DEP. So if you're checking that box, you really should be discussing that in the pre-app meeting with us before you go down that road. We may have some ideas and ways to avoid you having to go through the alternative BMP process, which could slow your project down as it goes through. Continuing on the ENS module. So that was quick. So let me get my train of thought here again. Table 1 doesn't need to be filled out for PAG02s or IP, individual permit applications. It's only applicable for ENS plans or ENS permits. Again, box 9 and 11 are the same thing. They're only for PAG01, so they're not going to apply just yet. Now, if you are using approved, pre-approved alternative ENS BMPs, there's a section at the very end of this section that will allow you to identify those BMPs. And those were included on the handout that we gave you of important links that was emailed earlier. And again, Table 1 is not required for PAG02 or individual permit applications. So as we go further, the ENS Module 1, 14, you're just going to be identifying the information, where the information is within, for seating within the plans. Number 16 is identifying where on the plans the recycling and disposal information is. Now, if it doesn't say this in the instructions, but if you put that information on the plans, you don't need to include it again on the NOI or application. You can simply pencil in where on the plans it resides, and that satisfies that comment. For number 18, remember that this is during earth disturbance activities, not post earth disturbance activities. So in 18, you're going to be talking about thermal impacts to surface waters. So what we get a lot is folks will put in here the post-construction state of the project, and this is during construction. So you need to look at thermal impacts that are potential during construction and put those here and what mitigating BMPs you're using to help prevent thermal impacts to waters. So now we're talking about the training and experience. So we've simplified this process. You no longer have to fill out that ENS worksheet. I think it was worksheet 22. If you're a professional, you check this box, and professional refers to what's in the regulation. So it's landscape architects, engineers, land surveyors, geologists. I think I hit them all. That's what a professional. It does not refer to a CPESC. In the regulation, it doesn't necessarily recognize that as a licensed professional. So if you're CPESC, I am trained and experienced in ENS control methods, fill out the information here. You can still put your license number in if you are a CPESC if you want to. But again, you wouldn't be checking this box. So now talking about PCSM Module 2. So this is required again for all NOIs and applications. So you're looking at both individual and general permits. Again, as it did for the E&S plan, it'll serve as a narrative component required for all PCSM plans. So you no longer have to put together the narrative. This will suffice, and it has all the information we need for a narrative. Again, you want to make sure that you have the directions out as you're going through, because whether it's a individual or a general, you'll have different options and different things to fill out in each. If there's any duplicate information, you don't have to refill it out again from Module 1. So, for example, if you have given us soils information already in Module 1, you don't need to provide it again. It's already there. I kind of like that feature because I used to get narratives that were this thick and this much in both narratives was the soils. So it didn't make any sense to me to have it twice. So that's kind of a good thing. So here we're going to go through and kind of go step by step. So the applicant needs to fill out the top portion to identify what the project is for, so on and so forth, the surface water you're discharging to, so on and so forth. Next, you're going to have the discharge point. Now, this is going to be relating back to your plans. So what you're naming your discharge points on your plans are going to need to be consistent with what you're naming your discharge points here. Next up, you have your BMP ID number. Now, it's important, you know, the NOI in this document need to be consistent. So you want to keep that in mind, and your plans all need to be consistent. I can't say that enough, because that's usually one of the biggest things that we see, particularly doing our completeness reviews, is that the consistency from the plans to the narrative to the NOI to now the modules and to the spreadsheets. There's different nomenclature, different numbering, and that really causes confusion. So now we're really sticking to what it's being called here. Next, you'll be identifying the BMP name. It's important here to utilize the BMP name that's in the PCSM BMP manual. Now, if you're using a BMP that's not in the manual, you'll need to come up with a name that best describes whatever that BMP is. That's really going to be the exception, and you're going to be really need to use what's in the BMP manual. And again, that name should be consistently used throughout the plans, the NOI, the application. All the information you're providing should all be consistent. Now, as you're going through, you may have undetained areas. So if you do have the undetained areas, you should be noting them here. Now, what this does is this is going to give us a quick check. So if you have undetained areas, your undetained areas along with your drainage areas should be summing up to it'll actually be the disturbed area now. So it should be summing to that disturbed area. If it doesn't, that's a quick check for you and for us to know something's up. And if you have site restoration projects, you'd be checking this box down here. Now, you may have projects that are partial site restoration, and you may have other portions that are not site restoration. So you would only want to check that box if it's a total site restoration. Typically, power lines, linear projects like that are generally going to be using this box. And it really cuts down on the information that you need to provide and prepare. So walking our way through the module, you're going to go through the sequence of BMP installation. Now, I've had a couple of, well, one application that's come in and they just cut the ENS sequence of construction and dropped it in here, which isn't necessarily what this is asking for. So what this is asking for is more along the lines of what is needed for the PCSM BMP installations. So in here, you're going to want to be describing how, if it's an infiltration BMP, how are you minimizing compaction to that BMP? Giving some, not means or method, but more sequencing and direction to the person who's actually going to be building this thing. And that's more the information we want here. Now, if your ENS sequence happens to contain all that information, you can just copy and paste it and drop it right in here. But again, that's not necessarily the intent. And you also need to identify the critical stages of inspections that are going to need to be done during the construction phase of the project. Nothing new here. This was all needed on the old NOI, and it's just a different way of approaching it. Number 3, you want to check the box. The drawings of PCSM plan have developed and will be available on site. Now, this box should always remain unchecked except for PAG 01s. So this isn't even available to us yet, and that's box 3. And you'll see when PAG 01 comes out why that is relevant and why that's needed. For PAG 02 and individual permits, you will always be checking this one. The plans have been developed and are available on site. And then again, nothing new. If you have any naturally occurring geologic formations or soil conditions that may have potential to cause pollution, you know, acidic soils, there's a bunch of them that could potentially cause pollution during construction. This is where that information should be housed. So again, walking through, this is where we're going to be talking about the thermal impacts during construction. So this is where your PCSM BMPs are going to be listed that are treating your thermal impacts. Whether you're planting trees, whether you're reducing impervious, so on and so forth, this is where it's going to go. And number 9, pre-development site characteristics. This is where you're going to be talking about infiltration and geotechnical studies. If you have a site restoration project, obviously you can skip this because you're not going to be talking about those things in that. So this is a lot to take in. There's a lot of information here, and this is sort of the, I'm going to say, kind of the meat and potatoes of this module. So you'll see questions 1, 2, and 3, and those should look familiar to you because they used to be on the old NOI, and they asked, what is your design standard? Now, it's going to be, if you have a 167 plan that's been approved by DEP within 5 years, that's going to be your first checkbox, okay? And that's what you should be using for your design. Now, if you don't have an approved 167, the design standard is based on managing the net change. So basically, this is meaning CG2, the design that's in the BMP manual, essentially. And then item 3, an alternative design standard. Now, with one exception, item 3, I don't want to say you can't use it, but you want to avoid using it. Because at that point in time, the burden of proof is on you to make sure that the project you're proposing, the BMPs you're proposing, and the fashion in which they're being connected is going to be as protective as the 167 or the, actually it would be number 2, the design standard within the BMP manual. So it puts a lot of burden of proof on you, and your calculations, your narratives, everything gets more complex. Now, that exception that I had mentioned is that if you have a 167 that is out of date, which is past 5 years old, but is still a valid 167, which we have a lot of here in Monroe, all of our studies are done, and they're watershed-specific studies. So the Broadhead, McMichael, Toby Hanna, they're all watershed-specific. So what you'll do in those instances where you have that 167, you're going to be checking an alternative design standard, but the burden of proof is within that outdated 167 plan. So your next, number 4, speaks to volume. So if you're the 2-year 24-hour storm event, here it is. Number 4, if you're using the spreadsheet, the DEP spreadsheet for volume, you check that box, include a copy of the spreadsheet with the module, you're done. You don't need to go any further. Now, if you're not using it, you need to go through and figure out and complete 5 through, I think 5 through 8. Yeah, you'll have to do 5 through 8. And that just kind of goes through the information that used to be on worksheet 4, if that makes sense. That's what you're going to be putting down here. But again, if you're using the spreadsheet, click that button, you don't have to do anything else. So, piece again, now we're walking through the infiltration information. This is set up by BMP, so you're going to want to be doing one of these for each of your BMPs that has infiltration. You'll be doing a number of infiltration tests, methods used for infiltration testing. Test pit identifiers, and again, you want to make sure that the test pit identifiers are consistent between what you're putting here and what you're showing on your plans. We see that quite a bit. Your average infiltration rate, your factor of safety, and then your infiltration rate used for your design will be here. And that should be consistent with your routings and other information that you're providing. And then if you have any particular comments that are germane to that particular infiltration testing or that BMP, this is the chance to provide those comments. And then we get into the peak rate analysis. Again, surface water name, discharge point, and you'll need one of these for each of your discharge points. So if you have 4 discharge points, we're going to be expecting to see 4 of these analyses. There we go. Again, if you're using the spreadsheet, you're going to want to attach that. If not, if you're using alternative rate calculations, you're going to want to attach those alternative rate calculations. When we get to that part of the presentation, you'll see, but the majority of times you're going to be attaching your own printouts. The rate worksheet or the rate spreadsheet is pretty rudimentary, and it might be good and applicable to small sites, but for the majority of what we do, it's not going to be something that you're going to want to go through. And then, you know, some other information on where your precipitation amounts are coming from, the source data. Majority of people using NOAA 14, or show of hands? Yes? That's good. That's what you want to be using. So here we go again with so number 9 is really kind of the critical part of this whole spreadsheet, or whole part of the application. So this is going to go through and identify, you know, whether or not you are meeting your obligations for rate. And then again, here is where we're going to talk about the difference. You know, you have your pre, your post, and then what's the difference. The PCSM Module 2. This is the Stormwater Analytics Water Quality. Now, this is a change from what we've done in the past. So, by a show of hands, how many people have used the new spreadsheet? All right, so it's at least half of you, maybe a little bit better. The new spreadsheet is required for water quality, and you'll see that if you use it for volume, it kind of makes the water quality analysis a little bit easier too, because it just kind of integrates the two components into one. So if you're checking a printout, well, you should be checking a printout of the PCSM spreadsheet. Water quality is attached. Now, if you use the alternative design standard and you're using an alternative water quality method, you wouldn't be checking this box, but again, the burden of proof is on you to provide documentation that what you're providing is at least as protective of what is required by this spreadsheet. And then we're going to go into the long-term O&M. BMP IDs, obviously you only have 3 sections here. More than likely, if you have a site of any significant size, you're going to have many more than 3 BMPs. So you'll have to either expand this section or provide additional sheets. And again, we talk about the PCSM plan developer, same as what was on the ENS. So we're going to talk a little bit about the spreadsheets. And I see some gazes starting to soften a little bit. Does everybody need a 5-minute break, or are we good? We're good? Okay, then we'll trudge on through. This is kind of get into the more technical aspects, so I want to make sure that we're all fresh and ready to go. So, under the general information tab, you're going to list, your project name, your county. This just kind of sets up some basic information about your project. Now, filling out these boxes, total project site, total earth disturbance, number of post-construction discharge points, and then how you're going to start your numbering. This is pretty important because remember a few slides ago when we were talking about the naming, the nomenclature, and filling things out per drainage area? It all relates back to what you're entering into these numbers here. So for this example, I'd also like to point out one thing. If you're using an older version of Excel, the spreadsheet is going to give you fits at times. we run, I think, 2007 in our office, and we have had issues with that. And it's a known issue. I just want to make you guys aware of it. If you're using an older version, tab generally doesn't work. You're going to have to use some arrows, and you may even just have to use the mouse to click in some fields. That's just a tidbit, FYI, from me to you, and you might be able to use it for leverage to update your software packages if you need that leverage. So kind of just ran through an example. Here we have 2 drainage areas, 2 discharge points. I'm sorry, and then we have the undetained areas. And again, this relates back to that form that we talked about previously at the very end where it had the undetained areas. These should be consistent between what you saw on the module and what you're seeing on the spreadsheets. So earth disturbance acreage, we're doing 2.5, 2.5, and obviously the undetained area is 0. And then I just kind of went through and filled out some other information down here, which talks about the Chapter 93 class and then whether or not there are structural BMPs proposed for that drainage area.
How did you get it to let you put the creek name? Because I tried it, it wouldn't type in the creek name.
That's an interesting question, and we want to make sure that we are utilizing the most latest version of the spreadsheets. And I think that was addressed in, I think, version 1.4. So right now they're up to version 1.5. Well, let me put a caveat on that. As of last week, they're up to version 1.5. Whether or not that's changed, I did not check yesterday or today. So they may be up to version 1.6 or 1.10, I don't know. But before you start a project, you really want to go back and make sure that you're downloading the spreadsheet anew. That way you have the latest version. And even really before you submit, if it's been a while, you'll want to double check, because we've had projects that have been submitted recently that they were utilizing version 1.0, and the errors that are in that are, it's essentially making the project incomplete. So now we move to the volume, and things that you're going to want to think about when you're using your volume is, number one, you want to fill in your information. So this checkbox right here, if you uncheck that, essentially what that means is that you're going to be entering in your own data for this information here. It's not going to automatically calculate those cells. Now, a word of caution, and this just may be an outdated version of Excel that we're working with, but if you're going to want to know whether you're going to be using this or not ahead of time. If you uncheck that button and you go through and you put all your information in, and you want to recheck that button, you have to clear the form to be able to do that. So you can't go back, and we'll talk about this with the rate analysis as well. So that's something that you want to be cognizant of and kind of know ahead of time going into it. Again, they reference No Atlas 14 here. That's where you should be getting your data from. I just kind of pulled that from thin air and stuck it in there. Number of rows, you're going to want to populate that, and then it'll give you, this instance is 3, so it'll give you 1, 2, 3 rows. Then you fill out your areas. If you're not summing to the total earth disturbance, you're going to get an error message. And it's going to say you're not summing, I think the actual error message says you're not summing to the total project site area, but it actually means total earth disturbance. So you'll see that come up, because that stumped me for a little bit, because I was at 5 acres and, or I was at, I forget, I was doing 10 acres and it was telling me that it wasn't summing to 10 acres, which threw me for a loop. But then I figured out that it's just an error in the error message of all things, and it's really pointing you to the total earth disturbance. So again, these should all sum to that 5 acres. Go down to your post conditions. You're going to be picking your land covers, picking your impervious areas, making sure again you're summing to that 5 acres. Now, you'll see here that you still have 3 rows even though 1 is unused. So if you're going to have, let's say, 2 rows in the pre-development condition and 10 rows in the post-construction condition, you're going to want to set this to 10. So that's the maximum number of rows that you're going to need, whether it's pre-development or post-development. Generally, most of us will have more in the post-development.
Quick question. Last time I checked the worksheets, you were only, for pre-construction, you were only available the meadow, forest, and impervious. You do a lot of work for PennDOT or utilities where you're, in the past, because it's a linear project, because it's a PennDOT project or whatever, you're able to use for the precondition, the existing ground cover, you weren't held to that 20%.
Well, that's an interesting question. And what he's asking is that for PennDOT projects or potentially for linear projects, you are able to use pre-construction cover types of what it actually is, instead of impervious, meadow, or woods.